to Stone and Chalk. For those of you that haven't been here before and that are watching online, we're the home to entrepreneurship here in Adelaide, and above us we have 3 floors with some 200 or so entrepreneurs that are based within here, and we're increasingly seeing a growth around proptech here and in our Sydney and Melbourne hub as well. We were founded in Sydney, and we were founded in fintech. We came together with some of the biggest banks and insurance companies in Australia, and with the support of government to drive and foster entrepreneurship activity in fintech. And over the last 5 years, we've seen outcomes including over $550 million of capital raised from our startups, and we've seen fintech activity grow immensely. And Stone and Chalk has grown and scaled up along that journey as well, and we've moved into emerging tech. We have a big focus here on AI, machine learning, cyber, space and defence, and we have a great cluster here of prop tech as well as some med tech and fintech as well. So it's great to be joined here by our speakers. Rachel, of course, has convened and supported this getting off the ground. Rachel is a founder of TC Pinpoint and a great contributor to the community here. We benefit from Rachel's insight on Founders Circle and a range of other activities that happen here as well. So it's great to welcome you, to have all of those watching online. Now, for all of you, you can see on that little screen what they're saying. So you need to address all your comments to that little black dot on the... Yeah.
So we need to behave.
And you need to behave because Big Brother is watching. We have cameras behind you as well. So I might kick it off by handing the mic across to Rachel, and you can take it from there.
Sure. Well, I'm going to hand the mic directly over to Daniel Gannon.
And I've got one on my lapel.
Oh, okay.
So I will take that and run with it, Rachel.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Thank you very much. For the benefit of those here and also those who might be viewing online, my name is Daniel Gannon. I'm the South Australian Executive Director of the Property Council. The Property Council is a membership-based organisation that represents typically landlords in Adelaide. Our genesis is from the Building Owners and Managers Association, but we typically advocate for commercial, industrial, residential, retirement living and retail subsectors of the market. So in terms of the conversation that we'll have today, you can probably see the connection that we would have to AI and big data, given the landlords that we have here in Adelaide. And just to set the scene a little bit with the composition of our membership, we're very different to Sydney and Melbourne. There's a big institutional footprint of property owners and superannuation funds in places like Sydney and Melbourne. We're a slightly different market here. We are a small, private, family-based property market here. And of course, that brings with it different challenges, different stresses, different pressure points. So any conversation around artificial intelligence and big data, I think is a really important one to have in Adelaide right now. And it's also really important just to reflect on where we are. We've just heard earlier, here we are at Stone and Chalk at Lot 14 in Adelaide's East End. This really has become the epicentre of not just the political world over the last 2 to 4 years in South Australia, but it also is really reflective of the new economy that we're seeing emerge. I was lucky enough moments ago just to take a really quick tour of the living lab downstairs with Michael OBrien from Optus. There's some amazing stuff happening here. I am, and I'm going to say this from the outset, not really clever when it comes to AI and proptech. So all of you are, I'm not, but I think it's a really important conversation for the property sector to have. We're really lucky to be joined today from my left to your right, my left, Rachel Kidwell, the founder of TC Pinpoint, Stuart Hosford, Account Director at Blue Prism, and of course George Ginakarakis, founder and CEO of Point Data. So we're really lucky today to have some thought leaders. We're going to do a little bit of crystal ball gazing as part of this really important conversation. We'll go for about 40 minutes. So for anyone here with us today that has a question, Milosh, I'm looking at you. Please raise your hand throughout the course of the conversation. We'll get to them. I don't know how we're going to get to the questions online yet, but I'm sure we'll work that out as we go. So please just take a really good listen to what you're hearing, absorb it, and then put your hand up if you see any need. So, Rachel, given that you are holding a microphone, I think we will start with you.
No, we're going to start with Stuart.
Well, okay, well, let's start with Stuart. So, Stuart, can we just go to the crux of this conversation? Let's talk about some of your strengths, some of the strengths of Blue Prism, how robotics can streamline, but also humanise the property value chain that we're seeing, and just reflect on what you're seeing in the market right now.
Well, I think Blue Prism is very much on the robotics end of the AI market, and when you say, you're not that smart about robotics or AI, there's quite a lot of AI that's not that smart either, which is interesting. Blue Prism and robotics is much more about execution and automating execution, but it works very well with a lot of the AI elements that we see out in the market. And it's continually evolving, and it's interesting to watch because it's almost like a human getting trained day by day, and they learn new skills every time you plug into a new natural language understanding element or a natural language processing or sentiment analysis algorithm. They get smarter and smarter as they go. But at their base level, they have to be reasonably well focused on mundane and repetitive processes to be effective. And what's been interesting in the market, in my experience over the last few years, is how robotics and AI has humanized some of the value chains, as opposed to the opposite, which is sometimes what people expect when we start to talk about robotics. And the reason I say that is what it's allowing people to do is get back to those jobs that they were probably hired to do. And I'm talking about, when we talk about the property value chain, I do a lot of work in mortgages, settlements, etc. But in mortgages, you've got people in branches that are advising people or paid to advise people on property purchases. It's a big decision. There's a lot to think about. A lot of those people traditionally have started to become a little bit overwhelmed with some of the mundane and back-end processes that they have to sit through. So they might be capturing spreadsheets, capturing loans, catching up on work that they need to do post-interview with a customer. And robotics can take that away and can do that work so that those people can then spend more time with the customers that they want to be in front of, and providing that high-value advice as opposed to just tapping away on a keyboard, which is really not that value added. So I think that's been the surprise to me in starting to work in robotics and AI, is that it's not really about robots taking over jobs. It's much more about how robotics is humanizing some of those elements and allowing people to do those jobs that they actually are inspired to do.
So Rachel, on that point, as we pass the microphone over from Stuart, there is a perception that AI and robotics will lead to job losses and fewer jobs as part of this new economy. Is that right or wrong?
And look, it's a fair assumption, but we all know that we're at such an early stage of the actual impact that it's actually going to create, that you can draw analogies from when or if Henry Ford asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. We need to have faith and trust in the fact that what we're creating is actually going to add that value and enable people, like Stuart referenced, to be more efficient around the human elements of what comes with the future of work. And that's what we're looking at along the lines of TC Pinpoint and our capacity to support the change and the digital transformation that comes with any element of change when you're introducing new things to a workforce. There's got to be that element of empathy and understanding and transparency and understanding the why of why these things are introduced, because we're never going to replace people. We know that, particularly after last year, that people need people. It's not something that's going to be replaced, it's going to be enhanced.
I can't imagine that Stephen Marshall, the Premier, would be putting so much effort into Lot 14 if it was going to be leading to fewer jobs moving forward.
Absolutely. We've got to be thinking about the future of work and what new economies that we can create, given what we're potentially losing along the manufacturing line, and what types of jobs that we want to create for our children and our children's children, and enabling them to stay here in South Australia and create those opportunities, which Lot 14 is doing.
So we're going to now pass down to George. Before we do that, it was probably remiss of me to not acknowledge the lands on which we meet today, the lands of the Kaurna people. Of course, we pay our respects to the Kaurna people, past, present and emerging. George Ginnakadakis, Point Data. Let's talk about how your business uses AI, and let's talk about how that new economy might look moving forward.
Yep, okay. So just as an introduction, we started Point Data in 2014. There was a lot of R&D around automating the property feasibility process, and then we moved into valuation. So the way we use AI is perhaps put a bit of a perspective of the speed at which we do things. We value every residential property in South Australia every week. and that includes all 12 large townships as well as the metro area. And we do that with an update of sales data that arrives through auctions and sales. And so every Sunday, our big machines apply the machine learning algorithms, and it's all ready for the registry, which we're in a partnership with on a Monday. So that just gives you sort of the speed and the scale at which we can do things.
You couldn't do that with a team of people, could you?
Well, it's just, you know, I mean, you can't update it every week. I mean, you know how the Valuer General updates valuations every year, I think.
Well, allegedly.
Allegedly. But we obviously do market valuations. The other thing that we've done is we've automated the property feasibility process, particularly the land side. So we've identified 155,000 developable property sites in South Australia alone, and we're rolling it out in Western Australia and Victoria as we speak. So again, that process is saving money and time, and that's what it's really all about. You know, it is about the efficiency of the process, how we can save time not only for banks but for property developers, for real estate agents, and so on. So that's what AI does. I think there is a space there which for what I call AI augmented human valuations, and I think there's going to be a transition between manual valuations and AI-driven valuations, and there is this sort of period where we're going to be doing both. But ultimately, it's really to improve processes and speed.
So, can we just talk about the property industry then, George? Some of the people that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, how do they embrace your technology? How do they respond to this conversation about how you can optimise their business?
Well, we've got some great testimonials of the technology that we're using at the moment. We've got one developer who said he took about 4 months to find property development sites that suited him. He analysed all of Unley. Now, we gave him a data set of 3 suburbs overnight, and then he had a starting point. So what he's done is, and he still has to go through that data and do his own due diligence processes, but it's that 4 months up front that he doesn't have to spend now, that he can just dive into the data and actually get on with what he wants to do, which is development. So that's a really good example, but there are many examples like that.
Rachel, you're a member of the Property Council's Future Trends and Innovation Committee. The composition of that group of professionals is quite broad. So just on the back of the conversation with George now about this leading edge technology, this conversation about proptech, how do you find the property industry and their embracing or not embracing of your technology?
They're scared. There's so much fear associated with it.
I'm a bit scared being here today, to be honest.
There's nothing to be scared about. Education will remove the fear. That's the mandate that I want to bring to the PCA committee, because we've got to start somewhere with conversations like this about educating. You know, we're learning as we go. I mean, George founded the company from nothing, as did I, and we've, learnt along as we've tracked along the way. And yeah, education is the biggest thing, and feeling the fear and doing anyway, but also those practical, tangible things that property owners can do is putting line items in their budgets for innovation and adoption of technology, and not being scared if it fails.
So can we just look at that for a minute? So some really pragmatic, small things that a landlord of a commercial property or a portfolio of commercial properties could look at. What are we talking about?
Insofar as the numbers, I think there's a fair and reasonable expectation. I mean, you can apply a percentage of your total budget, of your total spend, a percentage of your portfolio value. It's all about making sure that you not only incorporate what that innovation means in your overall business strategy, where do you want to go, and how can you put the flavour or the contingency in place to ensuring that it is okay if it doesn't work out. This is the piece that I think we really have to focus in on, because we're so used to everything being so tangible. Property is a thing, technology, that's is not a thing. You can't necessarily feel and touch it. You can see it. And with my background coming from retail construction and now into building technology, it's the biggest difference that I've seen. You know, you can go out on site and you can see the slab going down, the walls going up, and the services being running. But when you're building technology, there's so much faith that you put in your technology team to build something that you can't actually see. And I think that kind of spills over to the property industry at the moment, insofar as not quite understanding it.
So given the composition of our property industry here in SA compared to Sydney and Melbourne, is that more of a challenge here, or does the value proposition just have to be stronger?
Yeah, look, it is our job to make sure that we're continuing to refine our core value proposition. You know, that's all part and parcel of building a business. I think the sales process here is harder. Without a doubt, the majority of all of our customers are eastern states based. But how magic would it be if everybody mandated to spend X amount of dollars on local startups or new companies under the 5 years of age here in South Australia? That would unlock so many opportunities for us as companies to not only create those case studies that George refers to, but build the confidence that other people are going first, you know, and we're not purely just focusing in on the laggards. We're trying to build that environment of early adoption, which is exactly what we need.
Stuart, are you finding the same thing with your business? You know, with the South Australian property market, perhaps you need to put a lot of work in early to break that back, and then you're in?
Yeah, I think that would definitely be true. A lot of, you know, when you take on some of the technologies that we work with, it's, you know, change is important. It also takes a bit of a mind shift. It's a big exercise if you're going to be successful, or can be. You certainly need to approach things differently. You need to you need to welcome the technology and reorganize the team a little bit, because it's almost a new resourcing model for a business. I think about it less as it's technology and more like outsourcing 2.0, just outsourcing to a different type of workforce. So there's a lot to think about there. I think Adelaide businesses are still coming to that. There's a lot of reorganisation to take place. A lot of my work at the moment is also Sydney and Melbourne based. I will say, so I used to fly a lot up and down. But I see that changing here, and certainly I'm having many more conversations here in Adelaide. I haven't travelled for a year, but there's other reasons for that, of course. But it's becoming less of a requirement. I do have a lot more conversations down here. It's great that we're building places like this for people to come together and talk about these things. And I do think it will grow. And certainly I'm seeing some of that momentum grow up in South Australia as well.
And how important do you think Lot 14 is as part of that momentum story?
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. When I moved, I used to live in Sydney, and I moved to Adelaide 4 or 5 years ago as a lifestyle choice, knowing that.
And we hope you never leave.
Well, I will never leave. We are committed, fully committed. So when I moved down here, Lot 14 didn't exist yet. I think it was an idea and started to build from there. And there was definitely there was a bit of a chasm of like-minded individuals coming together. I used to work in the Stone and Chalk office up in Sydney, and you certainly feed off each other, and you start to come up with new ideas. And when you're looking for something, you walk around a room and you find somebody that's done something like that before, or who can introduce you to somebody else. That, as Rachel said, not just in what we're talking about today, but humans really need humans, and you learn that stuff just by walking the floor and talking to people and having a place to collect. The virtual meetings are all well and good, and everybody's getting used to them, but you just can't replace that sort of collective thought.
And for the benefit of those tuning in online today, Lot 14, as it stands today, is not what it was for the 160 years before today. Of course, it was what we colloquially refer to as the old Royal Adelaide Hospital site. It was the RAH site. There was a hospital here for a very long time. It's about 7 hectares in total, flanked to the north by the River Torrens and the south by the CBD. I think it's been our most exciting development opportunity for a long time in Adelaide after the RAH shifted west to the west end of the CBD. George, so with a lot of these things in mind that we've just spoken about, and the relationships that I know that you have with commercial landlords, industrial property holders, the residential game, are we ready? And if we're not ready to embrace AI and big data, and to Rachel's point, if we're not ready to put it into the budget and to really back it, do you think we're ready? If we're not ready, what have we got to do?
We're sort of ready. I think there are early adopters in the property industry who are embracing it very early, and in fact they can see the opportunities, and it's almost like they're ahead of the curve and they're taking advantage of it. There are parts of the property sector that are clearly not ready, probably because they've been doing it a certain way for a very long time. It's very hard to change that. I think as a state being ready, I mean, some of the pain points we've had is not only, say, visa requirements on internationals wanting to move here who we employ, which is great, particularly data scientists, but also how data is treated. After all, most startups need a sort of a sandpit of data to play with to develop their minimum viable products, and that varies between states. So for instance, New South Wales has an open data policy, so allows startups to play with data, whereas other states, you have to pay through the nose for it. So there is an inconsistency between states, and it depends on where you set up. It's either going to be hard or easy to make those first steps. Beyond those first steps, I mean, you need to get to minimum viable product to actually be able to get to a commercial raise and prove the technology out. And I think governments could be doing a lot more. In particular, governments could be embracing AI and these tech firms and actually employing them for certain parts of that value chain.
Can I presume that South Australia could be doing things a little bit better?
Look, South Australia, as Stuart said, is a pretty hard market. It's, you know, we don't have the population here to get things going. So I think government's a big player and defence is a big player in the state. So I think those two sectors can be doing a lot more to embrace and even sort of support all of those AI-driven tech firms in South Australia. But there are always things like procurement challenges and, you know, how do we treat data? It's not a consultant that we can hire, it's data. So, you know, there are challenges even here, and I think we need to get through that pretty soon.
Just a reminder to anyone here who might have any burning questions, please raise your hand. If we were at an auction just now, you would have just bought a house. So keep that elbow down. Rachel, you and I were lucky enough recently to have breakfast with Flavia, the founder of Fleet Space Technologies. And that was only a week ago to celebrate International Women's Day. Until that day, and this is how green I am with my thinking, I didn't realise that companies like Fleet Space were working with the Bureau of Meteorology and with SA Water to track things like weather and water flows. So that day for me was a bit of an eye-opener because I realised that putting satellites up in space was benefiting, you know, the sort of, you know, temperature control of streets across local communities. So is that what we have to do now, just to propagate stories like that out into the community?
Stories. I mean, if you use a vending machine these days to buy a Coke, you're using a satellite. It's in our everyday lives, but so many people don't realise it. And I think that's the most exciting part because, like Flavia said, it's so accessible now to be part of the space industry. And I don't think that we, in our current demographic, are aware enough of it. I mean, I guess we are. If we're in the tech industry, we're a bit more plugged in that way. But, you know, the schools, the kids, are they being exposed to this kind of really exciting new way of potentially moving their careers forward and educating the parents at home as well, who are also aware of it and encouraging their kids to move into it. And again, not being scared of it, you know, really appreciating the fact that it's in our everyday lives now. What more could we potentially do with it? And I think Flavia's story is a great one when it comes to that. I mean, she's a self-confessed space nerd from way back. That was her words, not mine. But I think that's so exciting. How can we get that sort of knowledge in the hands of more of our kids?
So Stuart, just on the back of what Rachel said then, I've got a 2, a 5 and a 7-year-old, and we're done with 3, by the way. 3 is...
I was done with 2 and then had 3.
Yeah, well, I thought I was done with 2 as well. So for my kids, And this is what often I say to the state government, do some storytelling, right? So Lot 14, Stone and Chalk, the businesses that we see on this wall as part of this community at the moment, if this is part of the new economy, how do we help, I'm 38, how do we help 40-year-old parents educate their young kids about jobs down the line, about choices at school, choices at uni or in trades, to then get into this new economy?
Yeah, I mean, I ask myself that same question a lot, and I think it is about stories. It's about making things interesting for them. It's about, like Rachel has just done, connecting the abstract to the stuff that they see every day and that they're excited about. I think they look around them and they do all sorts of things that might include bits of intelligence and tech that they're not really thinking about. So I think if you can help them connect those dots, the challenge is, as parents, we sometimes don't know those things ourselves. So I think we've got to keep challenging ourselves to understand the sorts of things that they'll be doing in the future. To Rachel's point earlier, humans will always need humans and they'll have an important part and role to play in the future, but the way in which they work will definitely change. We're not going to see mass attrition of human workers, I don't believe, but the way in which people will work will definitely change. So we've got to help our kids understand that they need to be looking for those things that will challenge them. There'll be certain things out there that are more disrupted than others, and we've got to help them build the skills to survive and thrive in whatever the future looks like. So I don't think there's a complete answer for that, but we've got to continue to look to help them understand what those skills look like, where they can learn them, and why they're important.
George, what do you think about that next generation piece? You've got a burgeoning team here in Adelaide.
Yeah.
How are you hunting that talent, but then the talent beyond them?
Well, it's a fairly young team, mostly in that 25 to late 30s sort of age bracket. Those that do come to Adelaide love Adelaide, so it is a lifestyle choice, as Stuart said. I think one of the, and they do know that they'll get paid less being in Adelaide, but obviously their cost of living is a lot lower as well. And they all say that. I think to attract people to your regional centres like ours, you need to set up all of the infrastructure and the support. So government setting up all of the mechanisms to ensure that a tech startup can actually be funded and can be supported, having the physical infrastructure in place, our 10 gig, was it 10 gig I think it was, although I think we've got 1 gig at the moment, but
sure. It was a good branding exercise.
It was a bit of a branding exercise, but all of that stuff is really good though. So everything that you can do to support both setting up businesses but also attracting the talent here is really important. And lifestyle is part of it, but it's also ensuring that there's a future here for that talent as well.
Of course, the value proposition for South Australia, I think, is really straightforward. We have a median house price that, George, unless you correct me at this moment in time, that still starts with a 4, high 4s, maybe low 5s. It's a median house price.
It's changing very quickly at the moment.
George will tell us on Sunday when they revalue the entire state. We have a median house price that starts with 5. We have, and of course, that's instead of ending in million like in places like Sydney. We have a commercial office rent rate that's probably somewhere between $400 to $500 a square metre, compared to places like Melbourne and Sydney, where it's probably closer to $1,000 to $1,500 a square metre. The lifestyle factor is huge. The number of people that I speak to from interstate that talk about the quality of our schools and education, proximity to the CBD, it's all here. The Adelaide piece, as someone who was born in New South Wales, I think is a no-brainer. Can we just talk about barriers for a minute? So, Rachel, and we'll flick down the line to you. Can we talk about barriers to AI and big data, whether it's government or private sector, and how we can remove them to streamline this experience?
I keep going back to education, Daniel.
Is it just purely awareness?
It's awareness and acknowledging that if we look at the resourcing piece that we as companies need to grow and support more customers, the people that we know to work for us in our companies are still in primary school. And again, the education piece, and I look up on the wall of companies that are here, and there's initiatives like, Code Like a Girl, 42, Her Tech Path. There's a number of fantastic initiatives that are working really hard now to enable that supply chain of people and resources that we need to continue to not only break the barriers of education, but by virtue of more people coming into the industry, that's going to happen almost like osmosis, the storytelling, education, it all comes down to that. I think people get really scared when you say AI, like what is AI? They're scared of it, they're scared of big data, the big headlines in the news about the consumer-focused data points when the Apple CEO declared that they were going to turn off cookies and Google went crazy because all of their
privacy
breaches. Yeah, it's such a huge topic that it all comes down to education and I guess having more access to more good quality storytelling and removing this kind of siloed nature of news cycles that can happen if you're only getting your news sources from certain places online.
Stuart, part of the challenge, I think, being someone who works in the property industry in South Australia, is you've often got to start with what's in it for the property owner, what's in it for the investors as part of the commercial building or industrial property. So do you think that part of the value proposition from the very start has got to be the savings, the efficiencies, the streamlining of services and costs as part of this conversation?
I think that is always the backbone of the proposition. I'm finding a lot of customer and employee experience benefits being rolled into the conversation as well. But I think you have to take care of that efficiency conversation first. And I find only once you've covered that off can you start to have the conversation around, how's your customer going to benefit from the experience, how your employee is going to be empowered by some of these jobs that are taken away that they don't particularly like doing, and what are you going to allow them to do in their new environment. So yes, we like to wrap in all of those things, but you're 100% right. The efficiency and what people call productivity is a huge element of that conversation. And we've started to talk about it for a couple of years now. The term that we use is not employee replacement, it's about hours back to the business, to take away to do with what you would like. So as a robotics team, we can give 100,000 hours back to that business that they were wasting on certain tasks that really didn't need to be done by a human. It's then up to the business to decide what do they do with that 100,000 hours. And
that's compelling, isn't it?
It's very compelling, right? You can, you imagine people sitting in a bank branch, as an example, or a broker network, where they've suddenly got all this extra time to go and spend with their customers or do some research or look at new markets. So that's become a very important metric, and almost all of our customers speak in that language now, as opposed to, I'm trying to find a way to move those 10 employees out of my business. It's more about what am I going to do with this new time that I didn't have before.
George, one thing that sort of sat with me throughout the course of this conversation, when you mentioned earlier that every Sunday your business can, the click of a finger, revalue properties. Why can't your business revalue properties and land instead of, for example, the Valuer General's office?
That's a very good question. It could, and we have run some experiments in that space as well. There are different ways in which properties are valued by government and different organisations for different reasons. So the methodology isn't similar, but we could certainly do it. We were actually approached, was an AI conference in Amsterdam, and approached by, I think, the Valuer General of Denmark, and they were pretty keen to do that. So I think there is an appetite for it, but it's more about whether we are ready to change. A lot of these processes are also, they've been in place for a very long time, and they are documented in a particular way, and that's the way it's done, and everyone is used to that. So one of the challenges we have, for instance, is...
That's a horrible way to do business, isn't it? Like, this is the way we've always done it, therefore we've got to keep doing it.
Yeah, but if we had, say, a valuation contested in court, a valuer can say, well, I use this method and I use 5 comparable sales, or we use up to 2,000 comparable sales. using a multi-dimensional machine learning model. I think it's got 25 dimensions, and you really don't know what it's doing most of the time, but it is accurate because it predicts valuations every week. It says this is what this house will sell for, and then it learns from its mistakes. So how do you actually change the system to actually accept AI? There's no, even the legal processes aren't there to accept it. So you can't indemnify an AI valuation, for instance, because you can't prove it in court.
So does that mean that different parts of our economy have to keep up with this pace?
Absolutely. Everything has to change. Yeah, you need the systems, the institutions, the governance structures, everything to change around it. And that's what I meant by the statutory valuations. There's a whole range of things that have to change. But we're getting there, I think, slowly.
Rachel, we haven't spoken about COVID. So let's talk about COVID.
How have we not spoken about COVID?
So I think that this is quite a refreshing conversation that we've had, and we're now 35 minutes in to a 40-minute conversation, which is a reminder to each of you here. That was a very long way of me saying you've got 5 minutes to put your hands up and ask questions, but here we are, 35 minutes into a chat about AI, big data, South Australia's economy. COVID. Does it speed things up for AI and big data? Does it put things back?
Well, I think if we look at our observations of our customers' general digital literacy and its capacity for speed over the last 12 months, I think that's a really positive, very basic level what we can look at of going, yes, COVID has certainly helped accelerate that. The capacity for the ability for the future of work to be reflected in a much more different dynamic way, not just with where we're located, but I think just opening people's minds to the possibility that things can be done differently, and they can and are starting to look at other solutions. We've certainly had our incoming inquiries level go through the roof in the last 2 to 3 months of people starting to sort of come out of that, and the retail landlords starting to really understand what it's going to mean for their assets. And generally that's a level of turnover, but there's still a level of confidence there that they're going to end up in a stronger place. It's just going to look different. So I think that capacity for the resilience and the malleability that we've all really created amongst ourselves for new things is the most exciting piece, I think, that's come out of it.
Just for context, before we flick to Stuart for some reflections on the same question, property industry confidence in South Australia right now sits at 127 points. 100 is considered ground level, so we're 27 points above the ground. We are in the second most confident jurisdiction in the nation behind WA. The national average is about 121, 122. And just to flick back to that land tax debate environment that we saw here back in 2019, we are more confident today, post land tax debate that seemed to consume the state, in the midst of a global pandemic. So, Stuart, given South Australia's resilience, particularly from an optimism and a confidence perspective, which, of course leads to transactions and a stronger economy, let's talk about COVID and what it means for your business and what you think lies ahead.
Yeah, it's been interesting the last 12 months for us. I've noticed both, and it depends on industry. So for some of the people I work with, it's airlines and travel, and that all fell to pieces. So we haven't heard or seen much of some of those customers, or they're starting to come back online, recover. They lost a lot of people. So that's been a very slow recovery, and there was a huge impact on the business that we do with the customers on that end of the scale. Then on the flip side of that, I also do a lot of work with banks, and it can depend on the bank or the institution, but there's been quite a significant acceleration in some cases, and some of that has been about business resilience. And as you would recall, some of the banks went on a push to do a big offshore shift. And what they're really focused in on now is what they're calling nearshoring. So they're trying to bring some of those jobs back. And that's great for Australia and it's great for robotics because you can bring some of those jobs back, but it's much too expensive to staff up all of them. You can staff up some of them and then you need to find some efficiencies and cost from somewhere else. But it's been a huge lesson. You know, you might have read some of the press in terms of how the Big Four handled that COVID. Some did really well, and those were the ones really that didn't have a strong offshore model. The ones that really didn't do very well and ended up with all kinds of bad press were the ones that were heavily dependent on an offshore model. So we've seen a significant pickup in the acceleration of their robotics and AI programs because they're looking to build up those resilient operations models which they didn't have before, that are less impacted by events like COVID. And you know, COVID will come and go, hopefully, and we'll recover, but there will be something else in the future. So it's about building that resilience to unknown events, and that has certainly accelerated some of the technology uplift in what we do.
Really good observations. George, we're going to round it out with you and your reflections on what COVID has meant for your business. And I'm really interested in this answer too, because it's really hard to determine the behaviours of investors and buyers, particularly in the resi market.
Yep.
So what's COVID meant? Okay,
I'll finish with that. I just want to start with what Stuart was saying. You know, as a business, you know, we decentralise. We've got 2 people in our Sydney office at the Stone and Chalk in Sydney, which is great. So COVID has pushed us into using systems like GitLab, Trello, Teams, whatever we need to make that work. So I think in a sense it's made us a little bit more efficient, but also allowed us to actually work across all states, and that's despite the office being here. From an economy point of view, it's changed everything. It's really funny, you know, the bankers say, I think it was a report last March said that the property market would dive by 7%, and it didn't. In fact, it actually grew, and we're in a boom equivalent of about a 25 to 35% annualised rise at the moment. So
across the board?
Across the board. About half of Adelaide's going up at that rate at the moment.
And is that a catch-up, or is the rest of the country going up at the same rate?
The rest of the country is going up at the same rate at the moment, but we started about 6 months ago. They've sort of just come in the last 3 months, so we started a long time ago. But there's these unintended consequences as well. So Home Builder, for instance, as a grant, has driven the whole development and building economy to the point where all of that latent demand, in fact future demand, has been absorbed. So I think you don't know what's going to happen next. You know, is there going to be a price cliff? Are we going to have some other sort of unintended things going on?
Supply of steel and timber.
Well, all of that. Sat in one of your committees and hearing some of your developers talking about tradies leaving Adelaide mid jobs and just going to Victoria, I think, because they pay better, or things like that. Like all of these things going on at the moment. Interest rates going down at the same time, so it is exactly opposite to what we thought it would be, basically, and it's driven demand in the property sector, which is quite interesting, but not in all parts. Obviously, retail is a different story.
And commercially, we're seeing investors interstate and abroad not just inquiring about properties in Adelaide, but purchasing them without actually inspecting properties. So that piece around South Australia's resilience and comparative healthiness and safety, I think has really driven the market in a positive way. The question is whether it's the catch-up or whether the rest of the nation's going up with us. That's a conversation for another day. Ladies and gentlemen, Rachel Kidwell, George Ginnakadakis and Stuart Hosford, please join with me in thanking today's thought leaders. And of course to Stone and Chalk and the team here, thank you very much for having us today. I think it's been a wonderful conversation that we could keep kicking on for the next hour if we could, but we can't. So to each of you, thanks very much for doing a little bit of crystal ball gazing today. I've had a wonderful time. Thanks for being here.